Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're not traveling to a place. We're looking at something you've probably done without thinking about it. Knocking on wood, crossing your fingers, avoiding a number, or trusting one more than you should. Little actions, small patterns. Things that don't seem like much on their own. But they all point to the same idea. The sense that what you do might influence what happens next. Tonight, we're talking about superstition. Not just where it comes from, but why it's still here. Because even now, in a world that feels more explained than ever, there are still moments where explanation isn't enough. This is the 50th episode of The Midnight Drive. And this feels like the right place to start connecting some of these ideas. Because up to this point, we've looked at a lot of different experiences, haven't we? Moments where something feels off. Places that don't quite behave the way you might expect. Situations where your mind fills in the gaps. Even when nothing obvious is happening. And all of those things have something in common. They happen in spaces where certainty breaks down. Where you don't have a clear explanation. Where cause and effect aren't obvious. And when that happens, people don't just sit with it. They go the next step further. They try to make sense of it. And that's where superstition begins. I remember reading a book as a kid. A book I probably didn't fully understand at the time. It was filled with ideas about luck, about signs, about patterns that were supposed to mean something. Things like pulling petals off of a flower. You remember. He loves me not. She loves me not. Simple. Repetitive. But it carried weight. Because even as a kid, there's a part of you that wants the outcome to be influenced by what it is that you're doing. That if you follow the pattern correctly, you'll land on the answer that you want. And it doesn't feel irrational in the moment, does it? It feels like participation. Like you're involved in the outcome somehow. That instinct doesn't go away. It just changes shape. Because superstition isn't really about specific action. It's about the relationship between action and outcome. The idea that something you do can influence something you have absolutely no control over. And that idea shows up everywhere. Take the number 13, for example. There's nothing inherently different about the number 13. It's just a number. But over time, it picked up meaning. People started associating it with bad luck. Avoiding it. Removing it from buildings. Skipping it entirely in certain situations. You'll walk into hotels that go from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. Not because the number itself does anything, but because enough people believe that it might. And that belief changes behavior. The same thing happens with Friday the 13th, a day that on its own is no different than any other. But once it's labeled, once it's connected to a pattern of bad outcomes, it carries a different weight. People notice more. If something goes wrong on that day, it stands out. It's Friday the 13th. It reinforces the idea, and the pattern continues. That's the key. Superstition doesn't need to be true. It just needs to feel consistent. And consistency is something the brain looks for constantly, even when it's not there. That's why certain numbers feel different. The number 7, for example. In a lot of cultures, it's associated with luck. It shows up in stories and traditions and religion. 7 days, 7 years, 7 symbols tied to meaning and significance. And over time, those associations build. Even when people who don't consider themselves to be superstitious still find themselves feeling something about that number. It shows up in sports. The 7th inning. The idea that something can turn around at that point in the game. Not because there's a real mechanism behind it, but because it feels like a moment where something could change. And that feeling is enough, because superstition doesn't operate on proof. It operates on perception, on the sense that certain patterns lead to certain outcomes, even when those patterns are incomplete or selective or built from coincidence. The brain connects them anyways, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Not knowing what's going to happen, not having control over the outcome, creates tension. And superstition offers a way to relieve that tension. Not by actually changing what happens, but by creating the feeling that you might change what happens. That if you just follow the pattern, if you do the thing, if you respect the rule, you're not completely at the mercy of chance. You're involved, even if that involvement isn't real. And that's why these ideas stick, because they give structure to something that doesn't have it. They create a sense of cause and effect where none exists. And once that structure is in place, it's very hard to let go of. Because letting go means going back to uncertainty. Going back to the idea that outcomes aren't influenced by the things that you do. That sometimes things happen without a clear reason. And for a lot of people, that's much harder to accept than the alternative. So the patterns stay. The numbers, the rituals, the small actions that don't seem like much, but carry just enough meaning to feel like they matter, even when they don't. And that's where superstition lives. Not in the object, not in the number, but in the space between what you do and what you hope will happen next. When was the last time you found yourself practicing a superstition, consciously or subconsciously? Let us know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. If you'd like, reach out to us on our hotline, 402-610-2832. 3-6. Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're talking about superstitions. Now, once you start noticing superstition, it becomes harder and harder to ignore. Because it's not just in numbers, it's not just in stories. It shows up in small, everyday behaviors. Things people do automatically without stopping to think about why they're doing them. Knocking on wood. It's one of the most common. Someone says something hopeful, something uncertain. I think this is going to work out. And almost immediately, they reach for the nearest surface. Knock, just in case. Just to keep things from going the other way. There's really no clear reason for it. There's no mechanism. But it feels like a form of protection. Like you're preventing something from being undone. The same thing happens with crossing your fingers. A quiet gesture. Often unnoticed. Done while waiting for an outcome. Hoping for something to go a certain way. It doesn't change anything. But it creates the feeling that you're involved in the result. That you've done something, even if it's small. And that's the pattern. Superstition fills the gap between waiting and knowing. Because waiting on its own is uncomfortable. You don't have any control. You don't have certainty. You just have time. And time without control can feel like pressure. So people do something, even if that something doesn't actually affect the outcome at all. They avoid saying certain things out loud. Logic being, I don't want to jinx it. That phrase shows up everywhere because speaking something into existence feels like it might push things in the wrong direction. Even when there's no reason that it should. So, people hold back. They hesitate. It's not because they fully believe it, but because they don't want to take the risk. And that hesitation is very revealing because it shows how much weight we give to possibility, even when it's completely irrational. The same thing happens in sports. Athletes develop routines, very specific ones. Maybe it's wearing the same item. Maybe it's repeating the same sequence. Maybe it's following the same pattern before a game. Because if something works once, then it becomes part of the ritual. And breaking that ritual feels like it might somehow change the outcome. Not logically, of course, but emotionally. Because the connection has already been made. This led to that. And because that's the case, it has to stay in place. Even if that connection was merely a coincidence. Even if it only worked once, the pattern sticks. Because it offers something valuable. feeling of control. And that feeling doesn't demand proof. It just requires repetition. The more a behavior is repeated, the more real it feels. The more it becomes part of how someone interacts with uncertainty. That's why even people who say they aren't superstitious still engage in these behaviors. They don't think of it as belief. They think of it as habit, as something harmless. But underneath that habit, the same structure exists. Action linked to outcome. Even if that link isn't real. And it shows up in very subtle ways. Choosing a lucky number without thinking about why. What makes the number lucky? Feeling slightly more confident when something lines up a certain way. You don't totally understand why you feel that way. Some would simply write it off as a hunch. Noticing when something goes wrong and connecting it back to something that you did earlier. Even when the connection doesn't hold up. Because once the pattern is in place, your brain starts looking for ways to confirm it. And you want to know what? It finds them. Not because they're always there, but because you're paying attention to them. And that's exactly how superstition reinforces itself. Through attention. Through repetition. Through the quiet belief that small actions might matter more than they actually do. You want to know what? None of this feels extreme. That's what makes it so easy to overlook. That's what makes it so easy for people to claim that they aren't superstitious at all, yet they still have the patterns embedded into their day-to-day lives. It doesn't require full belief in anything. It just requires participation. Maybe it's a quick gesture. Maybe it's a small decision. Maybe it's something done in passing that carries just enough meaning to feel important. And over time, those small actions build. They become part of how someone navigates uncertainty. How they respond to outcomes that they have no control over. Not by changing those outcomes, but by changing how it feels to wait for them. Because that's what superstition does best. It doesn't remove the uncertainty. It softens it. It gives the illusion that something is being done, even when nothing actually is. And you want to know what? For a lot of people, that's enough. Because the alternative is doing absolutely nothing at all. In sitting with the idea that whatever happens next was never something you could influence to begin with. What do you make of this? You're listening to The Midnight Drive. There is a point where superstition stops looking like small behavior and starts looking like a belief system. It's not in a dramatic way. It just becomes part of how someone understands cause and effect. And that shift usually happens in situations where the stakes feel higher, where the outcome matters more, where uncertainty feels harder to sit with. Because when something feels important, the need for control increases, doesn't it? And when control isn't available, people create it. Not by changing reality, but by building a framework that explains it. That's where superstition starts to overlap with various belief systems. Not all belief, but a specific kind. The kind that ties action directly to outcome. If I do this, then that will happen. It sounds simple, right? But it can take on a lot of different forms. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like devotion. Sometimes it looks like certainty. But underneath it, the structure is exactly the same. Action linked to result. Even when that link isn't actually there. This is where things become more personal. Because now, the pattern isn't just about numbers or gestures. It's about meaning. It's about interpreting what happens in your life as a response to something you did. Or maybe you didn't do. And once that connection is made, it becomes harder to question because it explains things. It gives a reason for outcomes that might otherwise feel random. If something goes well, for instance, there must be a cause. If something goes wrong, there also must be a cause. And that cause often gets traced back to behavior, to decisions, to moments that feel like they should have influenced the result. That's where the idea of transaction comes in. Not in a financial sense, but in a behavioral one. The belief that outcomes are earned or avoided based on what you do. That if you act the right way, you'll be rewarded. And if you don't, you won't be rewarded. That structure shows up in a lot of different places, doesn't it? Sometimes subtle, sometimes it's deeply ingrained. But the pattern is very consistent. A person is faced with uncertainty. They respond with action. And then they look at the outcome through the lens of that action, trying to determine whether or not it worked, trying to confirm that the connection exists. And when it seems like it does, the belief strengthens. Even if the connection is incomplete, even if it's based on selective memory, because the brain is wired to look for patterns that reinforce what it already expects. It notices moments that fit, and it overlooks the ones that don't. That's how superstition becomes something more stable, something that feels reliable, even when it's not. And this is where things can become a little complicated, because once belief is tied to outcome, it can start to influence how people interpret their lives. If something goes wrong, it's not just bad luck. It becomes a reflection of something, a missed action, a wrong decision, a failure to follow the pattern. And that interpretation can carry a lot of weight because now the outcome isn't random anymore. It's meaningful. Even if that meaning isn't accurate at all, that's the trade-off. Superstition offers explanation. But you know what it doesn't offer? It doesn't always offer clarity. It fills in the gap. But it doesn't necessarily fill it correctly. And that can create a cycle where people continue to adjust their behavior, trying to align it with the outcomes they want, trying to find the perfect combination, the right pattern, the right sequence of actions that will finally produce the result that they've been looking for. Even when that result isn't actually tied to any of those patterns. Because the belief itself becomes part of the system. It shapes perception. It filters experience. It determines which moments stand out and which ones fade away. And over time, that creates something that feels consistent. Something that feels like it works. Not because it does, but because it's being interpreted that way. That's what makes this version of superstition different from the smaller behaviors. It's not just a gesture. It's a framework. A way of understanding how the world responds to you. Even when the world isn't responding in that way at all. And once that framework is in place, it becomes harder to step outside of it. Because stepping outside means accepting something else. The outcomes aren't always connected to your actions. That not everything can be influenced. That sometimes things happen without a reason that you can trace back to yourself. And for a lot of people, that is the harder position to take. So, the pattern stays. The belief stays. The idea that what you do matters in ways that go far beyond what can be measured. Keep in mind, it's not because it's been proven, but rather because it feels like it explains something that would otherwise remain uncertain. And in that space, between action and outcome, that's where superstition begins something more than habit. It becomes a way of making sense of things. Even when the sense it creates isn't actually there. What do you make of this? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode so far. Please leave us a comment in the comment section below, wherever you might be listening tonight on the Midnight Drive. If you'd like, feel free to reach out to us on our hotline and leave us a message. 402-610-2834. 3:6. We have covered a lot of ground here tonight, but there's something to keep in mind here, that superstition hasn't disappeared. It hasn't faded as all of these things have become more explained. If anything, it's adapted because the conditions that create superstition haven't gone away. Uncertainty is still there. Outcomes still feel unpredictable. And people still want to feel like they have some kind of influence over what happens next. None of that has changed. What has changed is how those behaviors show up. They don't always look like traditional superstition anymore. They don't always involve obvious rituals, but the structure is still there. The same connection between action and outcome. The same attempt to create control in situations where control does not exist. It shows up in decision making, in the way people approach risk, in the way they interpret success and failure. If something works once, it gets repeated, not because it's been tested, but because it feels connected to the outcome. And if something fails, people look for the moment where it all went wrong, trying to trace it back, trying to identify the action that caused it, even when that action isn't actually responsible. That pattern is constant. It doesn't require belief in luck. It doesn't require belief in anything external. It just requires the need to explain, to find a reason. Because without a reason, there's only randomness. And randomness is difficult to accept. It doesn't give you anything to work with. It doesn't offer a way to improve. It doesn't offer a way to prevent something from happening again. So people build systems, patterns, ways of thinking that make outcomes feel more structured than they actually are. Those things make the world feel like it's responding to them on a personal level instead of operating independently. And those systems don't always look irrational from the inside. As a matter of fact, they feel logical because they're based on personal experience. They're based on personal observation. They're based on moments where something seemed to line up, whether it makes sense to other people or not. But those moments don't always represent the entire picture. They represent what stood out in the moment, what was remembered in the moment, what felt important in the moment. And that's enough to build a pattern around. Even in a time where information is constant, where explanations are available for almost everything, that instinct doesn't disappear because information doesn't remove uncertainty. It just changes where it exists. There are still things that can't be predicted. Still outcomes that can't be controlled. Still moments where people are left waiting without knowing what's going to happen next. And it's in those moments that the same behaviors show up. Not always consciously. Not always labeled as superstition. But functioning in the exact same way. Small actions, repeated patterns. The sense that something you do might influence something you can't. And even when people recognize that it doesn't, they still do it. Because the behavior itself serves a purpose. It reduces tension. It fills the gap between uncertainty and outcome. It creates the feeling that you're not completely passive, that you're participating in what's happening next. And that feeling is valuable. Even if it isn't accurate, it makes you feel valuable. Because the alternative is accepting that not everything can be influenced, that outcomes don't always reflect effort, that things don't always happen for a reason. And that position is harder to sit with. It doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't offer structure. It just leaves space, unresolved. And for a lot of people, that space gets filled, not with facts, but with patterns, with meaning, with connections that feel real, even when they're not. That's why superstition persists. Not because people haven't learned more, but because the need it addresses is still there. The need for control. The need for explanation. The need to feel like what you do matters in ways that extend far beyond what you can see. And that is what doesn't go away. It just changes form. Becomes quieter, more integrated. Part of everyday behavior instead of something separate. And because of that, it becomes harder to recognize. Not as something unusual, but as something normal. Something that blends into the way that people think, the way they respond, the way they move through situations they can't fully predict. And once you start noticing it, you see it everywhere. Not just in others, but also in yourself. In the moments where you hesitate, where you repeat something just in case, where you avoid something without any clear reason why. Because even when you understand it, the instinct is still there. That quiet sense that what you do might influence what happens next. And maybe that's the point. Not that superstition is something separate from us, but that it's built into the way we respond to uncertainty. A way of bridging the gap, so to speak, between what we know and what we don't know. And after all of this, after everything we've explored, that gap is still there. 50 episodes in, and it keeps coming back to this. Not the places, not the experiences, but the way we try to understand them. And the patterns we build when understanding doesn't come easily.